When you think of cannibalism, what comes to mind? A forgotten tribe in the Amazon rainforest? A barbaric, prehistoric survival ritual? Forget those images, because the truth may shock you. The most systematic, commercialized, and sustained form of cannibalism in human history was not practiced by barbarians. It was practiced by these people: kings, queens, dukes, and even the most powerful priests of civilized Europe. Forget collagen powder and kale smoothies. For hundreds of years, from the Renaissance to the Age of Enlightenment, the most luxurious and coveted superfood of the European elite was not saffron or caviar. It was medicine made from human corpses. This is no exaggeration. In the midst of the magnificent palaces, where art and music reached their peak, a macabre industry operated openly. They called it corpse medicine. And here was the paradoxical thinking that shaped it. They did not do this even though they were civilized. They did this because they believed they were civilized. For them, this was not animalistic behavior. This was the pinnacle of medicine, the assertion of absolute power. The power of a king did not stop at ruling over the living, but could also absorb the life force from the dead. This belief was so ingrained that it created a global market. Mummies looted from the Egyptian pyramids, moss growing on forgotten skulls in Irish catacombs, and even the fresh blood of recently beheaded prisoners all became expensive medicines. This is not a story about the madness of an individual, but the systematic madness of an entire ruling class. It is not a hidden secret, but a flaunted privilege. When a nobleman feels ill, his remedy does not come from the herb garden. It comes from the graveyard. This story will overturn everything you thought you knew about European history, about the line between luxury and horror, between civilization and the most primitive barbarism. How could a crazy idea, a practice that we now consider the depths of barbarism, have taken root and thrived so strongly in the heart of Western civilization? To answer this question, we must take off our 21st century glasses and step into a world where the boundaries between science, magic, and faith were virtually non-existent. The answer lies not in ignorance, but in a perverse system of logic that was incredibly convincing to the people of the time. The foundation of cadaver medicine was built on two main pillars. The first pillar was an ancient medical principle, enthusiastically promoted by one of the most influential figures of the Renaissance, Paracelsus. Paracelsus, a Swiss physician, alchemist, and astrologer, was a medical rebel. He burned the books of the classical medical masters and argued that nature placed a signature on everything, a sign of its usefulness. A heart-shaped leaf could be good for the heart. A seed shaped like a brain could cure headaches. This logic, pushed to its extreme, led to an inevitable conclusion. To cure a weakened human body, nothing is more powerful and similar than a healthy human body. A strong lung from another person could cure tuberculosis. A sharp brain could dispel melancholy. This was not cannibalism out of hunger, but medicinal transplantation at the most primitive level. In their minds, it was science observing nature and drawing logical conclusions. The second pillar, even more important and terrifying, comes from the world of alchemy. It is the belief in something called spiritus, or life force. Alchemists believed that the human body was animated by a subtle essence, a divine energy that was both physical and spiritual. It resided in the blood, concentrated in the heart, and especially in the brain, which was considered the seat of the soul. This life force was what gave strength, youth, and life. And here's the catch. When a person died of old age or of disease, their life force was said to be exhausted. But when a young, healthy person died suddenly and violently, a soldier killed on the battlefield, for example, or a prisoner executed, their life force was at its peak. The sudden death locked all that powerful life force inside the flesh, blood, and bones. So consuming these parts is not simply eating meat. It is an attempt to perform a transfusion of life force. Drinking the fresh blood of a condemned prisoner is a way to directly absorb his courage and vitality at the moment when it is most powerful. Crushing the skull of a recently deceased person is to extract the essence of the still fresh mind and soul. In their worldview, this is a sacred chemical process, a method of stealing life from death. This logic even infiltrates and justifies itself by distorting religious symbolism. In an age when Catholics attend Mass and believe in transubstantiation, where the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ to give eternal life, the idea of consuming flesh to gain life is not entirely foreign. Corpse medicine simply turns a spiritual concept into a mundane, material therapy. They do not seek salvation for the soul. They seek immortality for the body. With such a solid scientific and philosophical system to back it up, necrophilosophy went from superstition to mainstream treatment, taught in universities and prescribed by royal physicians. It wasn't an alternative, it was first-line therapy. And with such a compelling theory, it's no surprise that its most ardent proponents were those with the most to lose and the most power-hungry, the nobility and the royal family. They were the ones with enough money to buy the rarest medicines and enough power to believe they deserved them. And perhaps no king demonstrated his attachment to this dark medicine more clearly and famously than the king of Renaissance France. That king was none other than Francis I of France, or François Premier, a living symbol of the Renaissance. When people think of him, they often imagine a gentlemanly monarch, a generous patron of the arts, the man who brought Leonardo da Vinci to France and built the magnificent Chateau de Chambord. He was a man of light, of innovation, a sophisticated politician, and a fierce warrior. However, behind that glamorous image, this enlightened king was a loyal follower of the darkest medicine. He not only believed in it, he lived it every day. Historians and chroniclers record that King Francis I rarely went anywhere without a small bag or a jewelry box that he always carried with him. This was not a place to keep a love token or talisman. Inside was the king's personal medicine, a concoction carefully prepared by the royal physicians. Its main ingredient? Crushed human skull powder, mixed with Egyptian mummy powder and possibly a few other rare herbs. This was the king's first aid kit, his ultimate tonic. Whenever the king felt a headache coming on, when his body was tired after a long hunt, or when an old wound from the battlefield recurred, he would take a small amount of this gray powder. He believed that it would quickly restore vitality, soothe pain, and dispel illness. To understand this seemingly insane act, we must look at the reality of life as a 16th century king. Francis I was a man who often faced danger. He personally commanded armies, was wounded, and even taken prisoner at the Battle of Pavia. He lived in an era when medicine was primitive, a small infection could kill, and diseases like syphilis were rampant without cure. In the face of constant pain and death, the belief in a miracle cure that could directly transfer power from another person to oneself was extremely appealing. For Francis I and his physicians, the spiritus locked in a human skull was the most powerful painkiller and restorative that science could provide. More importantly, the use of this remedy was not a shameful secret to be hidden. On the contrary, it was a statement of class, a luxury fad of the aristocracy. In a society obsessed with status, owning a high-quality supply of human skull powder was evidence of extreme wealth and power. It showed that you could afford a rare commodity and had the connections to access the freshest and most potent supplies. When the king, who set the trends for all of Europe, openly used it, he turned cadaver medicine into a symbol of luxury. Every duke, every count who wanted to prove his position at court had to have it. It became a topic of conversation at banquets, an accessory of power like a sword or a jewel. The king's public use turned cadaver medicine into an industry. It created a thirst, and to satisfy that thirst, a gruesome international market was born, reaching its tentacles from ancient tombs in Egypt to the bloody execution grounds of Paris. The thirst of King Francis I and the European aristocracy for human medicine sparked one of the strangest and most barbaric chapters in history. Supply had to be met with demand. And the industry that supplied it operated on two main fronts, one global, reaching out to remote deserts, and one local, operating under the shadow of the guillotine. The global front centered on a commodity with a mystical name, mumia. Originally, the word referred to natural Persian tar, a substance believed to have medicinal properties. But then, a historical mistake occurred. Europeans saw the black, shiny substance used to embalm Egyptian mummies and thought it was the same thing. And so a mummy craze exploded. Explorers, merchants, and tomb robbers flocked to Egypt, not in search of gold or treasure, but in search of the bodies themselves, preserved for thousands of years. Ancient tombs, from the tombs of the great pharaohs to the burial grounds of commoners, were systematically violated and looted. Imagine the scene. Mummies dragged from their eternal resting places, broken, packed into crude wooden crates, and loaded onto ships. They crossed the Mediterranean, landing at bustling ports like Venice and Marseille, and from there were distributed to pharmacies across the continent. There, pharmacists would do the final work. Using large mortars and pestles, they would grind everything, dried bones, shriveled flesh, linen wrappings, into a coarse, blackish-brown powder. This mumia powder became a standard commodity, an indispensable ingredient in countless prescriptions for everything from headaches to stomach aches to the plague. Anyone with money, from middle class up, can buy it. But for the most sophisticated and powerful customers, like the French aristocracy, the powder from a 3,000-year-old mummy was not fresh enough. They believed that the spiritus within had faded with time. They craved something stronger, purer, a domestic luxury. And the source for this luxury market was the public execution ground. An execution in Paris was not just a show of justice. It was also a market. Pharmacists and servants of the noble families would stand in the crowd. The executioner, who by law had complete control over the body of the condemned man, suddenly became a merchant. He was the exclusive supplier of a commodity that no amount of gold or silver could match: fresh vitality. The most sought-after product was the human skull, which was believed to contain the soul and intelligence. It would be sold at exorbitant prices to royal physicians to make private medicines for the upper class. But it wasn't just the skull. The blood of executed prisoners was also a valuable medicine. People with epilepsy believed that if they drank a cup of fresh blood while it was still hot, the shock from the powerful vitality of the person who had just died would cure their illness. Human fat was melted into ointments to treat joint pain and skin diseases. Every part of the body of the executed prisoner was valued and sold. We today see the executioner as a symbol of death. People back then feared him and saw him as a special medicine man, a supplier of the most powerful remedies. And the price of a soul was not cheap. A fresh skull could be worth a small fortune, making it the ultimate symbol of wealth and a morbid commitment to one's health. But skull powder and fresh blood were just the tip of the iceberg. From these macabre raw materials, Renaissance physicians created a dark pharmacopoeia with recipes and methods of use that defy our most horrifying imaginations. The dark pharmacopoeia of Europe did not stop at crushing skulls or trading mummies. Those were the raw materials. From them, the doctors and pharmacists of the era developed a series of special recipes, each with its own macabre twist, that were said to target specific ailments. They turned barbarism into a methodical science. And one of the most direct and shocking of these treatments was blood therapy for epilepsy. In an age when convulsions were thought to be caused by demonic possession or a chaotic life force, it was believed that only a powerful shock could restore order. And the most powerful shock was the sudden deprivation of the life force of a healthy person. Picture this scene at an execution ground in Germany or France. An epileptic, desperate after years of suffering, is brought to the foot of the gallows by his family. They are not there to watch. They're there to be healed. They have paid the executioner a considerable fee. As the axe or sword swings and the prisoner's head falls, the treatment begins. The executioner, with the calmness of a man accustomed to his work, collects the still warm blood pouring from the prisoner's neck into a cup. The cup is then immediately handed to the patient, who must drink it while it is still warm. The belief behind this horrific act is that the powerful life force of the recently deceased will flood into the patient's body, overwhelming and expelling the weak spirit or demon that caused the illness. It is a desperate gamble, a public ritual where hope and horror merge. If fresh blood was a quick and fierce remedy, human fat, or Axungia hominis, was a more common ointment. It was considered an all-purpose liniment. The main source, again, came from executed prisoners. Their fat would be extracted, melted in large cauldrons, filtered to remove impurities, and turned into an ivory white ointment. Pharmacists could then mix it with herbs or other ingredients to create proprietary formulas. It was used to rub on joints tormented by gout, on muscles aching from rheumatism. They believed that the life force concentrated in human fat could penetrate the skin, soothe pain, and repair damaged tissue. Some German executioner families even became famous and wealthy from selling their own family ointments. In addition to blood and fat, bones from all parts of the body were also used. Crushed bones were considered a popular version of skull powder for those who couldn't afford the premium stuff. But the pharmacopoeia went further. Medical books of the time, such as Oswald Krall's Basilica Chymica from the early 17th century, included recipes calling for dried human heart powder to treat heart disease or tonics distilled from whole body parts. In pharmacies across Europe, alongside jars of fragrant herbs, one could find human skulls drying on shelves, large cauldrons still reeking of human fat, and heavy stone mortars used for the daily grind of bones. This was no clandestine operation. It was a trade, a passed-down technique, a gruesomely normal part of life. These recipes were not secrets. They were recorded, copied, and circulated. So how could a society reconcile the existence of Vivaldi's masterpieces with a prescription for human heart powder? This horrifying contrast reveals a deeper truth about the dark side of power and luxury. The coexistence of extreme beauty and extreme barbarism was the central paradox of this age, a paradox that played out every day in the most magnificent palaces of Europe. To understand it, we must understand that necrology was not just a medical practice. It was a display of power. Enter a palace like Versailles or Fontainebleau. Your eyes will be dazzled by gilded halls, mirrored rooms reflecting endless light, gardens meticulously manicured to the last leaf. Your ears will hear the delicate music of the harpsichord, conversations about philosophy, poetry, and art. Dukes and countesses will be dressed in silks and velvets, wearing the most expensive perfumes. This is the height of refinement, the face of civilization. But look behind the scenes of that lavish theater. In a private room, a nobleman is swallowing a spoonful of powdered human skull mixed with wine to ease a migraine. In the royal kitchen, a chef might be preparing a special remedy for a member of the royal family, the main ingredient of which is fresh blood. A court lady is applying a soothing ointment to her skin made from the fat of a condemned prisoner. To us, this is disgusting hypocrisy. But to them, these are two sides of the same coin of power. The ability to build magnificent palaces and the ability to order the most brutal remedies come from the same source: absolute power. It is the power to decide the fate of a nation and even the bodies of its subjects. This is the ultimate privilege. In the aristocratic worldview, humanity is divided. There are them, the chosen ones, and there is everyone else. The bodies of a commoner, a criminal, or a defeated enemy are like wood in a forest or stone in a mine. They are resources. Consuming a part of another person's body to preserve your own health is not an act of desperation. It is an act of supreme domination. It turns social hierarchy into a biological reality. Your body and life force exist to serve and sustain my existence. We today see cannibalism as the ultimate act of barbarism, bringing everyone down to the level of animals. They see it the opposite way. It is the ultimate act of distinction, of proving that they are so superior that they have the right to consume the lives of those below them to consolidate their power. While the aristocracy considered it a privileged and elite practice, the common people were terrified. They feared executions not only for their violence, but also for what happened afterward. The fear that their loved ones would be stolen from their graves and sold to apothecaries was a real thing. They called it the black magic of the physicians. It created an unbridgeable chasm between the rulers and the ruled. At the top, in the gilded palaces, was a form of cannibalism dressed in medical robes and luxury. And below, In the dark villages were fears and whispers of evil. When a barbaric belief is not only accepted but becomes a symbol of supreme power, what can stop it? Not a popular revolt, but a revolution even more powerful. A revolution in the very mind of man. That revolution did not come from swords or bullets. It came from laboratories, books, and curious minds that questioned everything. The collapse of cadaver medicine, a system that had existed for centuries and was sponsored by the most powerful, was driven by two unstoppable parallel forces: the rise of empirical science and the birth of something called modern common sense. One attacked its logic, the other its morality. The first attack came from the medical field itself. Anatomists of the New Age, such as Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, did something radical. They actually dissected and systematically studied the human body. Through astonishingly detailed works, such as De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the structure of the human body, they began to draw a whole new map of the human being. The body was no longer a vessel for a mystical life force or soul that could be shared. It was a complex and wonderful machine of organs, tissues, and systems. The heart was shown to be a pump, not a repository of courage. The brain was a complex control center, not a box of souls that could be ground into powder. With the mystery stripped away, the human body became an object of biology, not a raw material for magic. At the same time, alchemy gave way to chemistry. Scientists like Robert Boyle began to define the elements and study chemical reactions. The vague concept of life force could not be measured, isolated, or demonstrated in the laboratory. It was gradually eliminated from serious scientific discourse. A dose of powdered human skull was no longer considered a life force channeling, but simply calcium phosphate with impurities. Its magical power was exposed by logical and empirical thinking. Medicine began to look for remedies that could be proven effective, chemical compounds that could observably combat disease. The foundations of modern medicine were built on the ashes of cadaver medicine. But if science explained why it didn't work, it was the Enlightenment of the 18th century that explained why it was morally wrong. Thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau championed a revolutionary idea: the idea of human rights and human dignity. They argued that every individual, be they king or peasant, had fundamental rights and an intrinsic worth that could not be violated. The notion that one's body could be turned into a resource for another began to be seen as a hideous affront to humanity. A new sensibility was born. The brutality and superstition of the Gothic era were ridiculed and condemned. Public executions came to be seen as barbaric, and cannibalism, once a royal medical practice, was relabeled as a barbaric abomination. It becomes outdated, shameful, and a sign of ignorance. Of course, the change did not happen overnight. It was a slow transition that took decades. There was a time when a doctor might prescribe a new chemical and, just in case, add a dose of mumia to the mix. But gradually, by the end of the 18th century, necrophilia had been relegated to the margins of society, relegated to quackery and folk beliefs. The macabre industry that had dominated European medicine was destroyed, not by war, but by the power of knowledge and conscience. Yet the fact that it existed at all, and existed for so long, in the heart of civilized Europe, leaves a haunting legacy. It forces us to confront a final question, one that could change the way we think about history and the very nature of civilization itself. And here is the final truth, the most haunting conclusion of the whole story. For centuries, we have been told and retold stories of barbaric tribes in faraway lands who practiced primitive ritual cannibalism. We have used these stories, these images of barbarians, to reinforce our belief in the superiority of Western civilization itself. But the truth is, we have been looking in the wrong place. We have turned our lens outward, while the most barbaric acts are happening right here at home. The most systematic, commercialized, and sustained cannibalism in history did not take place in some jungle. It took place in London, Paris, Rome, and throughout the capitals of Europe. Its most ardent adherents were not loincloth-clad chieftains, but ermine-robed kings, pearl-wearing queens, abbey-dwelling priests, and revered scientists of the age. This was not cannibalism for survival, as in the tales of lost seafarers, nor was it a ritual of war to absorb the power of the enemy. This was cannibalism for medical and commercial purposes, a cold, calculating industry driven by consumers. And that was perhaps all the more terrifying because it was so normal, so systematized, so civilized. The irony and hypocrisy of it all is almost unbelievable. While European explorers and colonists traveled the world, writing in their diaries about the barbaric customs of other cultures, they themselves came from a society where the consumption of human corpses was considered a common medical practice. A nobleman could read a condemnation of Native American rituals while taking a potion containing Egyptian mummy powder to cure his illness. This story forces us to redefine the word civilization. Is it all about magnificent palaces and priceless works of art? Or is it about a basic respect for human dignity? History has shown that the two do not always go together. Let's return to the final image, the symbol of this entire story. A golden royal crown, a symbol of power, of order, of God's will. And placed next to it on a velvet cushion, a jar of ash-gray human skull powder. These two objects are not opposites. For centuries, they have been partners. The crown brings the power to possess the powder, and the jar, they believe, brings the power to hold the crown. It is a symbol of the intertwining of luxury and pathos, of power and madness, a permanent reminder that even in the brightest lights of history, the primordial darkness of humanity always lurks just below the surface. The history of necrophilia is more than a strange tale of the past. It is like a mirror reflecting back to the dark corners and inherent fears of humanity itself. It shows that people, driven to the brink by the fear of illness and death, are willing to believe anything, to take any action, as long as it promises a glimmer of hope for life. Looking back, we can easily scoff at their superstitions. But are we really any different today? In a world of exotic superfoods, expensive and proven anti-aging treatments, and health fads that come and go, we too are searching for our own miracle, our own elixir of life. We may no longer eat mummies, but our desire to control our fate and outwit nature remains. The ultimate lesson, perhaps, lies not in the strangeness of the remedies, but in the normalization of evil. These kings, doctors, and pharmacists did not think of themselves as evil. They believed they were advancing science, saving lives, acting rationally within the intellectual framework of the time. This shows how easily the most brutal acts can be accepted and rationalized when they're cloaked in the cloak of necessity, of medicine, or of power. The story of the cannibalism of European kings offers a final reminder. The line between civilization and barbarism is not a solid wall, but a thin line drawn in the sand, subject to the whims of human fear and desire.